Welcome, friend, to this quiet hour where we're about to slip through a hidden doorway in time and step into a world of sun-drenched stone, lavish secrets, and shadows that still cling to us across thousands of years. Tonight, I invite you to wander with me through the scented corridors of ancient Egypt, where every breath was more than just air. It was power, seduction, and sometimes even a trap. But there's beauty here too, threaded through every scandal and silent betrayal. Together, we'll trace how these vanished people chased immortality, drop by precious drop, leaving behind ghostly scents that still cling to scraps of linen and shards of alabaster buried beneath hot sands. Now, shall we begin? Long after the last chant faded into silence and the mighty stone doors of the royal tomb were sealed, something delicate lingered among the shadows. A faint trace of resin and crushed petals hovered in the stale air, as though the very walls had absorbed secrets whispered by priests in hushed voices. These ancient corridors, carved deep beneath sun-baked sand, still held on to fragments of fragrances once meant to honor the divine and preserve the grandeur of a life well beyond its final breath. Even now, when archaeologists cracked open forgotten chambers under the unyielding Egyptian sun, they sometimes caught a ghost of those aromas, an invisible thread that seemed to pull them backward through time. But why did the Egyptians pour so much of their souls into these scents? For them, perfume was never simply about pleasing the senses. It was a silent language spoken between mortals and higher powers, a promise of purity and devotion, a tool of allure, and an anchor for memory itself. In dusty temples where sunlight barely touched the floors, priests would anoint sacred statues, believing the gods themselves inhaled the offerings. Along crowded streets of bustling cities, sellers hawked small pots of scented unguents, promising protection, favor, or perhaps just a moment's escape from the pressing heat. Yet beyond the markets and temple courts, there stood a class of artisans whose skills bordered on the mystical. These perfumers moved in delicate circles around the palaces, their hands stained with oils and flower juices, their minds repositories of closely guarded recipes. To serve at the court of the pharaoh was to step into a dance of influence and discretion. A single unique fragrance could become a symbol of power, instantly tied to the presence of a ruler or queen. Whenever a perfumer was summoned into the marble halls, he walked with a heavy awareness that each vial he prepared might carry not only the favor of the monarch, but also the subtle weight of political maneuvering. Sometimes their workshops thrummed with whispered gossip. Was the latest consignment of myrrh truly from Punt, or had the traders mixed it with local gums? Could a new formula meant for the pharaoh's morning rituals be replicated, or was it born of a rare bloom that only unfurled its petals for one night each year? Such questions spun through the perfumed air, alongside motes of dust caught in slanting beams of light. In this world, fragrance was more than commodity. It was intrigue bottled in alabaster. The deeper one delves into Egypt's scented past, the clearer it becomes that these people did not merely enjoy fragrance for idle pleasure. They wove it into every layer of existence, binding the human to the sacred. Temples groaned under the weight of offerings, trays piled high with resin cakes, jars filled with thick oils that gleamed like sunlit honey. In these rituals, scent served as a ladder, lifting prayers upward on curls of smoke. Priests would wave burning censers before colossal statues, eyes half closed, lips moving in chants. To breathe in these sacred fumes was to stand momentarily between the worlds. Egypt's reach for exotic materials only expanded this reverence. Caravans inched across blistering deserts, groaning under loads of rare spices and aromatic woods. Ships hugged coastlines, carrying precious cargoes of cinnamon, frankincense, and perfumed balms. Merchants braved thieves and sudden storms to bring these treasures to the delta's bustling ports. Each amphora unloaded onto the docks whispered promises of distant lands. Some held resins tapped from trees growing in lands so far south they blurred into myth, while others bore crushed blossoms gathered by people whose names would never grace Egypt annals, though their labor filled these grand temples with unforgettable scents. And yet, it was not only kings and priests who sought to wrap themselves in fragrance. The common people, whenever they could afford even a scrap of scented fat, cherished it. A modest household might save for months to buy a small cone of perfumed grease, which they would place atop their heads during celebrations. As the evening wore on and the desert air grew cooler, the wax softened, trickling down to anoint hair and skin with jasmine or lotus. It was a simple luxury, but one that made neighbors smile and nod in approval, proof of hospitality, joy, and fleeting beauty. Among women especially, fragrance was both armor and invitation. In the labyrinthine gardens of palace quarters, whispers drifted beneath the canopies of sycamores. A young noblewoman might dab fragrant oil along her wrists before stepping onto the cool tiles of a shaded courtyard, hoping the scent would reach a favored courtier before her words ever could. Stories fluttered through the city of intrigues sealed not with written contracts, but with a breath of floral musk in the darkened alcoves of villas. Here, perfume transcended adornment. It became a delicate weapon, shaping desires and forging quiet bonds. Still, not every vial was destined to charm or soothe. For physicians, these same ingredients were allies in their struggles against ailments that seemed to creep from the marshes or dance in on the evening breeze. Doctors pounded roots and blended fragrant gums into salves meant to calm fevers or drive out invisible forces they believed lurked just beyond sight. Patients clutching small linen bags stuffed with herbs might find comfort simply by inhaling, trusting that each breath carried a measure of healing into trembling bodies. Such trust in sense power ran so deep that even in the final preparations for a person's passage to the next world, fragrance was essential. Embalmers layered natron salts and wrapped limbs with oils so richly scented that centuries later, when explorers first unwrapped the linen shrouds, faint notes still clung to the desiccated remains. To the Egyptians, these oils were not simply about preserving flesh, but about easing the soul's journey, ensuring that when it stood before divine judges, it arrived pure and pleasing. The craft that made all this possible was both humble and astonishing. Within modest courtyards, workers pounded petals in stone mortars, heated fats over gentle fires, and strained mixtures through woven cloth. They watched carefully for the precise moment when the concoctions changed color or texture, whispering incantations passed down by elders. Others shaped delicate vessels from alabaster and faience, knowing that even the container played its part in safeguarding these precious scents. Yet wherever wealth and rarity gather, deceit is never far behind. Some unscrupulous traders diluted imported myrrh with cheaper local gums, or sold oils thickened with wax to fool the unwary. There are fragments of ancient records where complaints were filed against merchants who delivered shipments that smelled suspiciously weak. Even the priests were sometimes drawn into scandals, accused by rivals of substituting temple offerings with inferior blends. The stakes were high. Fragrance was bound to honor, and to deceive a client, especially a powerful one, could unravel fortunes overnight. This preoccupation with scent spilled naturally into their expectations for eternity. Tomb walls painted with careful strokes depict banquets where the departed recline as servants anoint their heads, the air wreathed with perfume. Among the grave goods placed carefully beside gilded coffins, we find small jars still sealed, their contents long since evaporated, yet still cradling the memory of what once filled them. To step into these tombs was to be reminded that even in the afterlife, to be fragrant was to be blessed. Centuries later, archaeologists carefully pried open these vessels. Some found hardened residues that, when coaxed with modern solvents, released startling hints of their ancient profiles: sharp green myrrh, darkly sweet balsams, whispers of crushed lilies. Modern perfumers and chemists have teamed up to recreate these long-lost formulas. In sterile labs, they swirl distillates in glass tubes, their faces lighting up when a note emerges that seems to echo across millennia. A single breath can transport them straight into the candlelit sanctuaries of Luxor or the shaded promenades of Thebes. For those ruling Egypt, unique blends often became their personal signature, an olfactory emblem as recognizable as their headdresses or jeweled collars. Visitors to court might later describe not only the grandeur of the throne room or the precision of the guards, but the peculiar, unforgettable perfume that seemed to follow the monarch like a living aura. Within palace walls, this was as much a mark of authority as any decree sealed with the royal signet. And because courts are never free from ambition, scent sometimes served less innocent roles. Rumors swirled of confidants who rose or fell because of whispered accusations, claims that they had tampered with a vial intended for the sovereign's private use, or had smuggled secret formulas to foreign rivals. In a world so bound to ritual and belief, even a hint of betrayal carried by fragrance could shatter carefully woven alliances. The state itself recognized how critical these fragrant commodities were. Records detail taxes levied on imported resins, regulations aimed at curbing fraud, and official inspectors tasked with verifying shipments. To tamper with such goods was to risk more than financial ruin. It was to offend the very order that bound Egypt together, a realm held upright by offerings and the favor of unseen forces. Far from the cool stone courts and sacred precincts, everyday laborers still sought their share of these luxuries. Soldiers heading out on campaigns rubbed scented oils into their skin, believing it not only masked the dust and sweat, but lent courage and divine protection. Craftsmen preparing for local festivals might pool coins to purchase small pots of blended aromatics, hoping that in the throng of dancers and music, their personal notes would set them apart. The processes behind all this were painstaking. Flowers had to be gathered at dawn when their scent was most concentrated. Fats rendered from cattle or geese formed the base that would slowly soak up plant essences under the watchful eye of perfumers who stirred, strained, and cooled mixtures repeatedly until satisfied. Resin was ground into fine powders, then steeped until it surrendered its soul into the oil. Each batch was a gamble with nature, a negotiation with time and temperature that could yield brilliance or ruin. Purification rituals often accompanied these creations. Before major festivals, families scrubbed themselves clean, then anointed their bodies so lavishly that the scent seemed almost to radiate from within. Passing through the streets, neighbors could tell by fragrance alone who was preparing for a temple procession or marking a private milestone. In this way, perfumes stitched individuals into the broader tapestry of society. Strangely enough, traces of these same ancient recipes linger in modern perfumes. Certain accords that modern noses might dismiss as merely exotic or oriental carry direct descendants of Egyptian formulas. The intertwined warmth of myrrh and cinnamon, the velvety touch of lotus layered over spiced resins, these are echoes of an older world, speaking softly through every elegant glass bottle lining today's boutiques. And so we circle back to where we began, standing at the threshold of a tomb, breathing in air that's been sealed for centuries, imagining the last evening a high priest or noble reclined amid silken cushions, attended by servants bearing small flasks. The civilization that perfected these arts has long crumbled into sand, Yet in the quiet swirl of a recreated drop of perfume, it feels almost alive again. An entire empire distilled into a sigh, whispering its stories to anyone patient enough to listen. Among the many figures who moved through the ornate halls of Egypt's palaces, few held a position quite as enigmatic or as quietly influential as the royal perfumers. They were craftsmen, yes, with stained hands and sharp noses, but also confidants and gatekeepers to mysteries that even high priests sometimes hesitated to claim. Picture them walking the cool, shadowed corridors of vast stone complexes, copper trays balanced expertly in their hands, each bearing delicate jars sealed with wax or fine cloth. Their robes, though simple compared to the lavish garments of courtiers dripping with gold and lapis, carried subtle embroidery, marking them as belonging to an exclusive order. It was a quiet, almost coded insignia, not for show, but so that the right eyes would recognize their standing. These perfumers rarely spoke of their recipes in open company. Knowledge was power, and theirs lay in the precise proportions of crushed blue lotus, the measured hours a resin must warm over coals, the moments when one scent was strong enough to meld with another without losing its soul. Such secrets were often passed down within tightly knit families. Fathers taught sons, mothers tutored daughters, each generation guarding formulas that could secure the favor of a palace for decades. Because their work didn't merely delight the senses, it shaped perceptions, cemented alliances, even safeguarded the very health of rulers. If a pharaoh rose each dawn to be anointed with a particular blend that promised vigor and divine favor, it was these perfumers who prepared the precious salves. If a queen's chambers were kept fragrant with floating bowls of scented water to soothe her thoughts, it was because the perfumers had chosen which petals to scatter. A single miscalculation, an oil too heavy, a flower past its prime, could bring displeasure that rippled outward through an entire court. Thus, their power was quiet but formidable. A nod from a chief perfumer could secure a junior artisan's future or doom a competitor's workshop to ruin. They might whisper to an overseer that a certain merchant's shipment of incense was impure, effectively cutting off that trader's access to royal contracts. Or they could recommend an obscure rural grower whose fields yielded superior blossoms, suddenly elevating a modest farmer to favored supplier of the palace. Their workshops, often nestled within the palace complex, but always apart from the main thoroughfares, were realms of fragrant intensity. Inside, rows of alabaster jars lined narrow shelves, each carefully labeled with neat hieratic signs. Bundles of herbs hung from rafters to dry, and braziers sent up thin streams of smoke that carried experimental blends into the rafters. Assistants, many little more than children beginning their long apprenticeship, scurried to stir vats, strain extracts, or grind petals under polished stones. Yet, despite the apparent industry, an air of hush always hovered in these rooms. Conversations dropped to murmurs when strangers approached. Recipes were recited in guarded fragments, often in coded language. Some even believed that special incantations were spoken over mixtures to bind them spiritually, ensuring their effects would align with the intentions of the one who commissioned them. Whether this was true or merely part of the cultivated mystique, it added to the aura of reverence and apprehension that surrounded these artisans. Being a court perfumer was not without its luxuries. Though they wore modest garments for work, records and tomb paintings show them enjoying feasts alongside other esteemed servants of the palace. They reclined on cushioned benches, accepted offerings of delicacies from silver platters, and sometimes received small gifts from the royal family itself: rings, fine linen, or pieces of jewelry bearing protective symbols. Such tokens weren't merely compensation, they were public acknowledgments of trust, signaling to all that this perfumer's hands, and by extension his secrets, were bound to the household of the pharaoh. Still, the line they walked was delicate. A perfumer who grew too bold, who perhaps hinted that his concoctions could influence affections or manipulate moods beyond what was sanctioned, risked attracting dangerous scrutiny. It was one thing to craft a balm that calmed a monarch's headaches, quite another to imply that a fragrance could sway a pharaoh's judgment on matters of state. Whispers of sorcery were never far from the edges of their profession, and the wrong rumor at the wrong moment could turn favor into peril. This interplay of privilege and risk imbued their position with a tension that few outsiders fully grasped. To serve the palace was to dwell perpetually in a space of hushed reverence, to be close enough to power to shape its very breath, yet always mindful that proximity could burn. And so these perfumers moved with careful grace through Egypt's glittering courts. Their eyes missed little, their tongues chose words with exquisite caution, and all the while their hands worked tirelessly to bottle not just fragrance, but influence, memory, and, in some small way, the destiny of an empire. In the hush of dawn, when the Nile's mist still clung low over the reeds, temple doors creaked open and priests emerged, bearing braziers that breathed slender streams of scented smoke into the awakening sky. For the Egyptians, this was no simple act of ceremony. It was the very language by which they spoke to realms unseen. Fragrance rose like a fragile bridge, each curl of incense a whispered petition that might catch the notice of gods who ruled over flood and harvest, birth and decay. To them, scent was not merely an earthly delight, but a conduit for the divine. In towering sanctuaries where sunlight filtered through high columns and fell in shifting pools across carved floors, offerings were laid out in careful order. Loaves, fruits, vessels of beer, and always small heaps of resins or cones of perfumed fat. Priests approached colossal statues of deities with heads bowed, their hands lifting incense burners whose contents had been chosen with almost sacred precision. Frankincense to purify, myrrh to honor, kaifi to soothe and invite favor. The thickened air swirled around the silent effigies, enfolding them in invisible garlands, and it was believed these scents fed the very essence of the gods, sustaining their goodwill toward the land. Smell itself held a symbolic power far beyond simple pleasure. To smell sweet was to be clean, favored, touched by harmony. To reek or be surrounded by rot was a sign of imbalance, an invitation for chaos. Thus, rituals often began with fumigation. Priests would swing censers in great arcs, letting waves of resinous perfume drive out malign forces clinging unseen to pillars and tapestries. They treated the temple not just as a place, but as a living being to be cleansed and fortified by breath after fragrant breath. In papyri preserved beneath centuries of sand, chants whined alongside instructions for preparing incense, revealing how tightly magic, prayer, and recipe were bound together. Recitations paired with the crushing of herbs, the blending of oils, each step both practical and spiritual, so that by the time the mixture touched flame, it was believed to be charged with intention. A wisp of this sacred smoke carried the words of mortals skyward, slipping between worlds as easily as sunlight through papyrus reeds. Outside temple precincts, families performed simpler rites at household shrines, burning small offerings to ancestors or local spirits. Even these humble flames twisted upward, scented by crushed petals or a dab of unguent. A mother might whisper a plea for her child's health, trusting that the drifting aroma would reach benevolent ears far beyond her mud brick walls. In funerary rites, perfume sealed the promise of an unbroken journey. As embalmers worked to preserve bodies, they laved the flesh in aromatic oils, believing these not only protected it from decay, but also marked it as worthy of recognition in the lands beyond. Coffin texts speak of gods who delight in sweet odor, suggesting that to arrive in the afterlife bearing fragrance was to arrive prepared, already in gentle conversation with eternity. Even the mythologies of Egypt wove scent into their telling. In stories of divine birth and resurrection, fragrant winds heralded the presence of gods, drifting ahead of them like advance couriers. A field might bloom suddenly with unfamiliar sweetness, signaling that some great power was near, hidden just beyond mortal sight. In these tales, aroma became almost a character in its own right, a subtle but potent herald of forces shaping human fate. Thus, from monumental temples to modest hearths, scent carried Egypt's hopes and devotions, a delicate bond spun from resin and flower, bridging the seen and unseen with every breath. Far beyond the shifting dunes that cradled Egypt's green heart, caravans set out from bustling ports and sun-scoured market towns, their long lines snaking over horizons painted in blinding gold. These were no ordinary traders carting grain or simple pottery. Their beasts carried treasures less visible, yet infinitely more coveted. Bales of resin wrapped in woven mats, jars sealed tight with wax to imprison fragile scents, bundles of rare bark and fragrant wood destined to ignite both altar fires and human desire. From the cool cedar groves of Lebanon, men felled towering trees whose wood breathed out a sweet, resinous hush. Loaded onto creaking carts, these fragrant logs began their slow march southward, guarded by hired spearmen and watched over by merchants whose fortunes hung on the safe arrival of each shipment. In Egyptian temples, cedar was prized not only for its scent, but for its incorruptibility. Its aroma whispered of endurance against rot and ruin, making it a favorite for ritual fires and stately coffins. Even more exotic journeys began along the shadowed escarpments of the African Horn, where gum trees bled tears of myrrh and frankincense. Local gatherers moved deftly through thorny groves, scoring bark and collecting droplets that hardened into amber-hued jewels under the sun. These lumps were small enough to fill leather satchels, yet each handful might equal a year's wages for a field worker along the Nile. Camel trains wound out from these thorn forests, bearing the precious harvest across burning salt plains, where mirages rippled and sunstroke hovered like an invisible predator. In some ports along the Red Sea, ships bobbed low in the water, heavy with amphorae packed with spices and resins. The crews slept on deck wrapped in damp cloths to keep the fierce winds from stripping skin, dreaming of the gold and linen their cargo might bring once offloaded at Egyptian docks. Sometimes these voyages ended in shipwrecks. Greedy coral claimed vessels whose remains, centuries later, still cradled shards of perfume jars within their sandy graves. Others came from even farther. Cinnamon sticks rumored to be carried on monsoon currents from mysterious southern coasts, or rare flowers gathered in highlands where local kings demanded heavy tribute before allowing harvesters to cut a single stem. Myths bloomed alongside these trade routes. Tales told of distant islands inhabited by giant birds whose nests overflowed with aromatic herbs, or lands where rivers ran thick with liquid amber. Though many such stories were more poetry than fact, they served their purpose, inflating the wonder and, importantly, the price of every fragrant parcel that finally reached Egypt. When these caravans at last approached the Nile's lush ribbon, they became living processions of foreign marvels. Townspeople turned out to see them pass, drawn by the chance to glimpse handlers leading strange beasts burdened with woven cages, or to breathe a faint preview of unfamiliar sweetness leaking from imperfect seals. At customs posts, scribes hunched over wooden tables, recording every consignment with meticulous care, while guards checked for hidden bundles that might slip through untaxed. In palace storerooms and temple treasuries, these imports were treated as more than simple goods. Priests oversaw their weighing and cataloging, invoking blessings to protect the delicate bounty from mold or theft. The arrival of a new batch of punt myrrh or Syrian pistachio resin might spark quiet celebrations among perfumers eager to test fresh mixtures, to see if a slightly different soil or harvest season had lent new subtleties to the familiar notes. Thus Egypt, though already rich in its own native lotuses, papyri, and rushes, stretched invisible hands across mountains and seas to draw in a world of fragrance. These distant lands, with their secrets of thorny groves and shadowed forests, became silent partners in the rituals of the Nile, their scents mingling on temple altars and in palace halls, telling stories of long voyages, risky trades, and fortunes made or lost on the weight of a single perfumed jar. It is easy to imagine that perfume in ancient Egypt was the exclusive privilege of glittering palaces and solemn temples, that only pharaohs and their closest courtiers ever felt the cool trace of fragrant oil trailing down their skin. Stories handed down through centuries have often painted just such a picture, of lavishly adorned nobles reclining under carved colonnades while slaves fanned them, the air heavy with imported myrrh. But the truth that rises from humble shards of pottery, from faded murals in village homes, and from the quiet notes of accounting scribes is far more nuanced and in many ways more revealing. Among the wealthy, of course, perfume was elevated almost to an art form. Elaborate concoctions blended rare resins with delicate blossoms harvested at dawn, suspended in fats clarified again and again until they gleamed like sunlit cream. These oils were stored in vessels so finely made that they could themselves be considered treasures. Slender alabaster flasks, squat faience pots, glazed in shades that mimicked the cool Nile at twilight. Such containers might be carried by attendants who trailed behind their masters, ready at a subtle gesture to dab scent along the wrists or behind the ears. For these privileged few, fragrance was not merely a personal delight. It was a social language, a declaration of status and cultivated taste. Yet evidence persists that the simple folk who tilled fields, hauled stones, or sold onions by the roadside also found ways to surround themselves with pleasing aromas. During local festivals, when entire communities poured into dusty courtyards to watch dancers or listen to traveling musicians, the market stalls did a brisk trade in small cones of scented fat. These were inexpensive compared to the private blends of the aristocracy, made from local tallow mixed with crushed herbs or flower extracts that could be gathered from the banks of nearby canals. When evening descended and the air cooled, these cones softened atop carefully braided hair, sending thin rivulets of perfume across necks and shoulders, drawing appreciative comments from neighbors. Such moments carried layers of meaning beyond mere indulgence. For many, these humble scents signaled hospitality and festivity. A house that smelled pleasantly during a celebration, that welcomed guests with bowls of fresh-cut reeds mingled with mint, or that offered a dab of sweetened oil to a visitor's hands, was a house known for its warmth and generosity. In these shared spaces, perfume became a communal joy, binding people together under the watchful eyes of local gods. Meanwhile, artisans and workers who saved enough to afford occasional drops of perfume did so for reasons that touched equally on practicality and quiet pride. The desert sun was merciless, sweat an everyday reality, and a bit of fragrant oil served to mask the more pungent signs of labor. It was also a small badge of dignity, proof that even after long hours in the fields or quarries, a man could make himself presentable for supper with family or an evening stroll through the village lanes. What truly endures in the scattered traces of these lives is a simple truth. While the elite certainly reveled in exotic imports and secret recipes guarded by palace perfumers, the longing to smell pleasant, to mark special days with scent, belonged to everyone. It threaded through Egypt from the highest throne to the humblest mud brick threshold. If anything, the myth that only pharaohs wrapped themselves in perfume does a disservice to countless ordinary Egyptians who found their own ways to capture fleeting sweetness, who paused amid the grind of daily life to enjoy a breath of something lovely drifting across sunlit courtyards. In the shaded courtyards of grand villas, where water trickled through narrow channels and the scent of flowering shrubs hung heavy in the still air, the art of attraction unfolded in delicate, deliberate gestures. For Egyptian women of rank, and for many who simply dreamed of rising higher, perfume was as essential to their allure as kohl around the eyes or strings of beads resting cool against the skin. A well-chosen fragrance could turn a passing glance into lingering fascination, could wrap whispered promises around a suitor long before any words were spoken. Stories drift from the palace harems, where competition for attention shaped daily life. Here, women prepared with meticulous care, bathing in basins where oils floated on the surface, ready to cling to warm skin. Servants massaged perfumed salves into their mistresses' shoulders and hair, weaving invisible wreaths that would release subtle breaths of sweetness with every turn of the head. A favorite blend might feature crushed lotus mingled with a drop of resinous balsam, creating a scent both delicate and undeniably captivating. To stand close to such a woman was to be drawn into a spell woven from memory and longing, one that could haunt even the most guarded hearts. Within these private quarters, intrigues often blossomed alongside garden blooms. It was whispered that certain women possessed oils enhanced with rare aphrodisiac herbs, gifts from distant relatives, or secret purchases from discreet merchants who promised effects that were as much rumor as reality. Whether these mixtures truly stirred deeper impulses or merely provided the confidence of belief, their power in matters of affection and rivalry was real enough. A rival might grow anxious on catching an unfamiliar but beguiling note trailing after her competitor, wondering what new strategy was at play. But the spell of scent extended far beyond the closed doors of royal compounds. In bustling town squares and along crowded festival streets, young women with simple braided wigs would sometimes save up for a small dab of floral essence before attending communal dances. Just a trace of fragrance turned shared laughter and fleeting touches into charged encounters. Under lanterns strung between poles, where shadows danced with the music, many a promise was exchanged, guided as much by a hint of jasmine drifting on the night air as by spoken vows. Even in marriage rituals, scent played a tender, almost ceremonial role. Before wedding feasts, a bride's relatives might anoint her with special oils prepared by local wise women, meant to bless her union with joy and fertility. As she moved among guests accepting congratulations, her passage left gentle eddies of perfume that mingled with the rich aromas of roasting meats and honeyed cakes, marking her out as the center of that moment's world. And so fragrance in Egypt was never merely an ornament. It was an intimate form of expression, a silent language of desire and hope. It promised what lips hesitated to confess, carried secrets through crowded chambers, and lingered long after footsteps faded, ensuring that memory of an encounter remained vivid, almost touchable, for days to come. In this way, scent became not just a tool of beauty, but a soft, persistent force that could sway the course of hearts and whisper of futures still unwritten. Beyond the allure of seduction and the splendor of ritual, fragrance in Egypt carried yet another profound purpose. It was woven tightly into the fragile realm of health. In a land where the sun blazed with punishing constancy, and the river's generous floods could just as easily bring pestilence as prosperity, people reached instinctively for remedies that soothed the body and calmed the restless spirit. Perfumed oils and aromatic fumigations became allies in these daily battles against unseen forces that lurked in the water, the air, and perhaps even in the favor of distant gods. Healers, often doubling as priests, prescribed treatments where scent was not an afterthought, but the very core. Papyri that survive, their ink faded to the color of dry reeds, list formulas intended to drive away fevers, ease inflamed joints, or settle violent coughs. These recipes called for resins like frankincense, known for their cleansing smoke, or myrrh steeped in warmed oils, then rubbed gently into aching limbs. In many cases, the medicinal power lay partly in their natural antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties, though the ancient Egyptians understood this through the lens of balancing humors and placating spirits rather than microbes. Illness was rarely viewed as a purely physical invasion. A lingering headache or a wasting disease might be blamed on hostile entities drifting invisibly through the air. Thus, incense played a dual role. Its pleasing scent could calm the sufferer, while its rising tendrils were thought to carry away malevolent forces or confuse them so they lost their hold. Homes undergoing a particularly troubling bout of sickness might be thoroughly fumigated, each corner chased by curling plumes of aromatic smoke until the very walls seemed to breathe out renewal. For digestive troubles, perfumed tinctures were sometimes consumed in cautious drops, mixed into beer or honeyed wine. Recipes recommended cinnamon, cardamom, or even small quantities of ground flowers, ingredients whose pleasant aroma was thought to harmonize the troubled workings of the belly just as surely as it delighted the senses. When inhaled, these same mixtures could serve to revive someone faint from heat or emotion, restoring balance with a few sharp, fragrant breaths. Even mental disorders were treated through the subtle persuasion of scent. Those weighed down by dark moods, tormented by anxieties, or haunted by troubling dreams might be anointed with specially prepared oils, believed to draw out harmful influences. The gentle hands of family or attendants applied these balms in slow circles, a ritual as much about comfort and human closeness as about driving away spiritual gloom. In such moments, perfume became not merely a medicine, but a tender promise of hope. Did these aromatic treatments truly heal? By modern standards, their power would often fall short, and yet there is little doubt that many of these oils did soothe irritated skin, that certain resins offered mild antiseptic benefits, and that above all, the ritual, the trust placed in careful hands, the enveloping of pain in gentle fragrance, brought relief of a kind that runs deeper than chemistry alone. In this way, the perfumes of Egypt stood quietly at the crossroads of body and spirit, easing the burdens of both with every scented touch. Long before glass cases displayed elegant perfume bottles on marble counters, long before modern factories poured fragrances into machine-stamped vials, Egypt's artisans were already shaping vessels with a precision and beauty that spoke to how dearly they prized scent. Each small jar or flask was more than a container. It was a silent guardian of the treasures it held, crafted to protect volatile oils and rare resins from the greedy hands of air, light, and heat. The earliest perfume containers were simple in form but clever in purpose. Alabaster, with its smooth, almost luminescent surface, became a favorite material. Cool to the touch, even under a blazing sun, it naturally helped preserve the delicate contents within. Skilled stonecutters hollowed out tiny cores with remarkable delicacy, shaping narrow-necked bottles that controlled the flow of oil so a precious blend would not spill wastefully in an eager hand. Later came faience, that luminous, glazed ceramic that could mimic the turquoise of Nile waters or the deep greens of marsh reeds. Faience flasks were often adorned with floral patterns or protective symbols, tiny lotus blooms or eye motifs meant to ward off harm. These vessels did double duty, pleasing to behold even when empty, a whisper of the luxury that once filled them. Glass, though rarer and initially imported, gradually entered Egyptian life and changed the landscape of perfume storage. Early glass vessels, often streaked with bands of cobalt or amber, were fragile marvels, their colors catching the light like drops of captured dawn. The craftsmen who made them stood on the shoulders of foreign masters, likely drawing from techniques developed in Mesopotamia and further east, but soon developed local styles that turned these tiny amphorae into works of art. Sealing was an art all its own. A plug of linen or finely turned wood, sometimes coated in resin to ensure a tight fit, would cap the narrow mouth of a vessel. Wax might be dripped over this closure, hardening into a protective shield that could be marked with the owner's seal. Breaking such a seal was a moment of deliberate ceremony, the tiny fracture of hardened wax giving way to the first breath of aroma, a rush of sweetness that might have waited months or even years for release. The makers of these containers held their own honored place in Egyptian society. Stonecutters, potters, glassworkers, each carried hard-won knowledge passed down through careful instruction, every apprentice learning to feel the subtle resistance of alabaster under a chisel, or to judge the precise moment when a molten glass bubble was ready to be coaxed into its final shape. Their workshops lay humming with quiet focus, filled with shards of discarded attempts and shelves lined with vessels cooling under careful watch. And so the perfume itself was never just about the liquid. It was a union of scent and shape, of artistry contained within artistry. To hold one of these ancient flasks was to cradle a story, a promise of fleeting delight protected by hands that understood how fragile beauty could be, and how important it was to guard it fiercely until the right moment arrived. Not all the scented wonders of Egypt were what they claimed to be. Wherever luxury gathered, opportunists inevitably followed, eager to turn fragile trust into quick profit. Along the crowded avenues of Thebes or in the bustling stalls that rimmed Memphis, sharp-eyed traders offered small pots of oil and fragrant pastes, extolling their virtues with practiced charm. For the unwary, the promise of a rare myrrh or a delicate foreign blossom could prove far more illusion than reality. The reasons for deceit were as simple then as now. True myrrh from Punt, or fine frankincense that arrived on camel caravans from beyond the Red Sea, was staggeringly costly by the time it wound through taxes, transport, and risk of theft. A merchant might pad out pure resin with cheaper local gums that mimicked the look but lacked the depth of aroma. Oils sold as containing exotic cinnamon could in fact be perfumed with common reeds or colored with crushed bark to suggest richness that was only skin deep. Some deception was brazen. A street vendor might present tiny alabaster pots sealed with fresh wax, the mouth tantalizingly scented with a drop of true imported oil. Hidden beneath, the bulk was nothing more than bland animal fat, waiting to reveal its lackluster nature only after the coin had changed hands. Buyers who discovered the trick too late often found their complaints met with shrugs. Merchants melted into the press of the marketplace, ready to appear tomorrow under a new name. Other ruses were more sophisticated, harder to unravel even by experienced noses. Certain perfumers devised clever blends using local flowers and clever distillations to approximate the scent of imported treasures. While not always malicious, many buyers knowingly accepted these imitations at a reduced cost. Some unscrupulous sellers passed them off as genuine, commanding exorbitant prices for what was essentially an inspired counterfeit. Even the temples and palace stores, where goods arrived under watchful scribes, were not immune. Records exist of inspections turning up shipments that weighed suspiciously light, amphorae found half filled with dregs or mixed with inferior resins. These incidents led to swift penalties. Merchants caught cheating the state risked fines that could bankrupt a family, or forfeiture of future trading rights, a punishment that cut deeper than coin. Whispers from palace servants spoke of quieter intrigues, of lesser courtiers bribing perfumers to deliver diluted blends to rivals, ensuring a subtle but humiliating exposure when an expected glorious scent faded too quickly or soured in the heat. Whether entirely true or woven from envy, Such stories added a layer of caution to every fragrant transaction. And so, alongside the heady beauty of Egypt's aromatic world, ran a steady current of suspicion. Buyers learned to crack seals personally, to test a small smear upon the wrist, waiting for it to warm and reveal its heart. Trust was a valuable commodity in its own right, earned only through repeated honest dealings. Even thousands of years ago, the delicate balance between genuine luxury and clever deceit rested on little more than a drop of oil and the promise that what lay inside was worth the glittering price. Deep within the silent stone chambers of Egypt's tombs, where torchlight danced across painted walls crowded with stories of hunt and harvest, scent performed one final solemn duty. Among the wealth of grave goods, the jewelry meant to adorn, the bread and beer to nourish, the tiny carved servants who would labor eternally in the fields of the afterworld, nestled jars of aromatic oils and bundles of resin wrapped in linen. These were no mere tokens of status or indulgence. They were essential provisions for a journey that Egyptians believed stretched far beyond the last breath. To step into the realm beyond life was not simply to wander in shadow. It was to present oneself before divine judges, to be recognized and embraced by deities who delighted in purity and sweetness. Texts painted or carved inside tombs made this expectation unmistakable. Gods were described as welcoming those who approached, fragrant like lotus, their skin anointed, breath perfumed, utterly pleasing in every way that mattered. Thus, the living went to great lengths to ensure that the dead would arrive in this realm prepared. Embalmers massaged bodies with richly scented oils, not only to slow the hand of decay, but to mark the departed as honored, worthy of gentle passage. Resinous unguents seeped into linen wrappings, creating a barrier both physical and spiritual, repelling earthly corruption while simultaneously inviting divine favor. Tomb inventories list jars of myrrh, fragrant woods, and small cones of perfumed fat placed carefully alongside the sarcophagus. These offerings would serve the departed long after mourners sealed the tomb doors, a fragrant arsenal against the trials of the underworld. Some texts even offered explicit instructions, detailing which aromas pleased which gods, ensuring that the deceased could call upon these scents like secret passwords at celestial gates. Scenes painted on tomb walls reinforce this vision. Banquets of the afterlife show the dead reclining joyfully, attended by servants who anoint their heads, sending thin threads of perfume into the air as music plays. This was no idle fantasy. It was a blueprint for eternity, promising that the comforts and refinements of earthly life would continue unbroken. And so scent became a kind of sacred ticket, proof that the one who passed from this world did so enveloped in grace. When archaeologists centuries later cracked open these long-sealed spaces, they sometimes found traces of that devotion still clinging to wrappings or pooling in the corners of jars. Ghostly hints of resin and floral oils that had waited patiently in the dark, carrying the hopes of ancient hearts across an unimaginable gulf of time. In this way, perfume stood watch over the soul's most vulnerable crossing, a gentle assurance that even in the vast unknown beyond life, one would be greeted not with suspicion or harsh judgment, but with the warm, welcoming breath of familiarity. Imagine the hush that falls over a sun-baked excavation site when, after hours of brushing away grit and coaxing loose stubborn stones, a worker's hand pauses on something cool and oddly smooth beneath the sand. The call goes out, voices hush, and soon a circle of faces peers down at a fragile vessel that hasn't felt the warmth of sunlight in thousands of years. It might be a small alabaster flask, its surface still faintly luminous, or a delicate glass ampule streaked with colors that ripple like trapped rainbows. And within, astonishingly, may lie a hardened residue of what once was liquid luxury, the breath of an ancient garden arrested in time. These are moments that have replayed countless times across Egypt's storied landscape, from the towering tombs of Thebes to modest burial shafts along the delta's shifting edges. Each discovery carries with it the tantalizing promise of recovering not just objects, but experiences. For scent is unlike stone or gold. It is fleeting, intimate, a presence that dances close to memory and emotion. To uncork a vessel sealed millennia ago and catch even a ghost of aroma is to stand for a heartbeat shoulder to shoulder with those who lived, hoped, and dreamed under the same relentless sun. In the Valley of the Kings, researchers once pried open a small container from a noble's tomb, only to be enveloped by a faint, sweet note that hovered in the dry air before dissipating. It was as though the long-dead occupant had reached across the abyss of centuries to share a personal indulgence, whispering, "This was how I chose to scent my life." Another dig revealed traces of thick resin lining the interior of a jar, which chemical analysis suggested held a blend of myrrh and possibly cinnamon or cassia. A mix designed, no doubt, to cradle the deceased in warmth and gentle familiarity as they ventured into the halls of divine judgment. In some cases, bits of linen still clung stubbornly to hardened lumps of oil, preserving not just the memory of fragrance, but actual molecular remnants that scientists could coax back into revelation. Under the careful eyes of chemists, tiny samples were dissolved, analyzed, their signatures mapped against modern substances. What emerged from these painstaking studies were profiles of aromas at once alien and eerily familiar, woody and balsamic, sharp with green herbs, softened by the breath of crushed blossoms. The most ambitious efforts went further still. Modern perfumers, working alongside archaeologists and organic chemists, attempted to recreate these scents in living form. In sterile labs thousands of miles from the Nile, they combined distillations of frankincense and labdanum, sweetened them with lotus absolutes, adjusted ratios again and again under glaring lights. Then, cautiously, they lifted a small blotter to the nose. Reports of these moments often verge on the poetic. One researcher spoke of feeling an unexpected tightness in the throat, not because the fragrance was overwhelming, but because for a fleeting instant it collapsed time itself. Inhaling, he imagined processions moving solemnly into temple courtyards, priests swinging braziers heavy with resin, and guests reclining at a feast while servants anointed their foreheads, the scent rising into torchlight. Yet these reconstructions, wondrous as they are, can only approximate the original symphonies of aroma that filled Egypt's palaces and sanctuaries. Time plays cruel tricks on organics. Volatile compounds fade, subtle notes decay into silence. What remains is often just the deeper base, the earthy ghosts of woods and gums, missing the bright sparkle of freshly crushed petals or the delicate lift of green shoots. Still, even these shadows are enough to send imaginations racing, to plant vivid scenes in the minds of those who catch them. And there is something deeply human in this pursuit. Across centuries, hands reach out not for glittering jewels or towering monuments, but for the quiet intimacy of scent. A reminder that these long-vanished people were not so different. They too paused to savor a moment, to draw a sweet breath and let it soothe worries or invite delight. In uncovering the perfumes of the past, we uncover a tender connection to lives once lived fully, under the same stars that still watch over us now. Each recovered scent is a fragile thread, binding us to hearts long turned to dust, yet whispering still of love, vanity, comfort, and a shared longing to be remembered. In quiet laboratories filled with gleaming instruments and the faint antiseptic tang of solvents, modern scientists and perfumers wage a gentle, almost poetic battle against time. They lean over fragments of hardened resins scraped from the insides of tomb jars, scrutinize microscopic fibers plucked from mummy wrappings, and coax secrets from residues that have lain dormant for over 3,000 years. Their mission: to call back to life the elusive, intricate scents that once drifted through Egypt's golden courts and temple halls. The journey often begins with painstaking analysis. Small samples, barely more than dust, are dissolved and passed through sophisticated machines that tease apart their molecular signatures. Charts bloom with colorful peaks and valleys, each corresponding to a different compound. From this data, researchers piece together tentative recipes, noting the presence of myrrh's warm balsamic richness, frankincense's citrusy lift, and darker undertones that hint at labdanum or storax. Sometimes they discover unexpected guests, traces of mint, or the telltale markers of true cinnamon, which would have traveled astonishing distances to reach Egyptian hands. Yet identifying these components is only half the struggle. Recreating how they once smelled is an art layered over science. Modern versions of these ingredients rarely behave exactly like their ancient counterparts. Trees grow in changed climates, soils differ, cultivation methods have evolved. A drop of today's myrrh oil might sing with sharper notes than the velvety depths the pharaohs favored. Thus, perfumers working on these reconstructions must rely as much on instinct and historical texts as on chemical readouts, blending in careful increments, closing their eyes and letting centuries melt away as they inhale. Some of the most ambitious projects pair archaeological teams with master perfumers who specialize in historic scent. Together, they consult papyri that survived Egypt's sun and sand, studying recipes inscribed by scribes who never imagined their formulas would be resurrected millennia later. These scrolls often read like delicate spells: 3 measures of honey, 2 of sweet rush, 1 of cinnamon bark, steeped in oil pressed from the first harvest. Such lines become blueprints, guiding modern hands that stir these ancient combinations under sterile hoods rather than temple fires. When at last a test blend emerges that seems to echo the past, the moment is nearly sacred. Testers describe a hush falling over the lab. They lean in, cautious, as though not to startle something fragile. Then, softly, the first breath. Perhaps it is the cool shadow of blue lotus, a petal mout so fleeting it feels like a sigh. Or the mellow embrace of cedar that speaks of sun-warmed courtyards and painted palace columns. In these stolen instants, it seems almost possible to stand beside a noblewoman as her servants smooth scented oil into her hair, or to follow a priest stepping barefoot across temple stones, censer swinging from his hand. These reconstructed fragrances are more than curiosities. Museums now occasionally invite visitors to encounter them, offering small paper blotters infused with the revived scents. Guests close their eyes, hold the strips to their noses, and find themselves startled by how immediate and intimate the past can feel when delivered not through sight or sound, but smell. 1,000 facts about dynasties and wars vanish, replaced by something profoundly human: the hush of someone's private pleasure, a moment of calm or pride captured in a fragrant breath. Still, those involved in this work are humble about its limits. No one can claim to recreate perfectly what once drifted through the alabaster halls of Akhenaten or clung to the linen wrappings of queens laid to rest beside the Nile. Time steals too much. Yet even an approximation bridges a staggering gulf, letting us inhale a fragile memory of lives long turned to legend. And in doing so, it proves that of all our senses, perhaps scent alone is powerful enough to break the grip of ages, allowing the perfumes of forgotten dynasties to breathe once more into the world. In the rarefied chambers of Egypt's palaces and the shadowed sanctuaries of towering temples, fragrance was more than personal adornment. It was a proclamation of rank, a silent but insistent mark of divine favor. Here, scent functioned as an invisible scepter, cloaking those who ruled and mediated between mortals and gods in an aura that instantly distinguished them from all others. When a pharaoh passed by, it was not only the shimmer of gold collars or the glint of lapis on his brow that signaled his supremacy, it was also the unmistakable drift of a perfume no commoner would ever know. Exclusive recipes, closely guarded by palace perfumers and temple compounders, were crafted to serve not merely as luxury, but as olfactory emblems of sovereignty and spiritual elevation. These formulas often wove together the rarest elements pulled from Egypt's sprawling trade networks. Drops of resin from punt, thick, honey-sweet with a faint balsamic edge, melded with blue lotus extracts that left a ghostly, almost narcotic floral trail. Into this base might be folded delicate shavings of imported cinnamon or cassia, substances so precious they were tallied by scribes alongside gold and gemstones. To create such blends was a task entrusted only to those of proven loyalty and unmatched skill. Within workshops screened from the casual passerby, master perfumers supervised apprentices who carefully weighed each component on tiny calibrated scales. The mixtures simmered over low fires, stirred with rods of carefully selected woods that would not taint the final scent. Protective prayers were murmured at each critical step, part ritual, part insurance against human error when working with substances valued literally by their weight in silver. For the pharaoh, this personal fragrance served as an olfactory standard, every bit as authoritative as the crook and flail he held on festival days. When he entered an audience chamber, courtiers recognized his nearness first by scent, an anticipation that rolled through the hall even before he spoke. Some records suggest that diplomatic envoys, granted audiences with the ruler of Egypt, later described the distinctive perfume as part of their reports, noting it alongside his words and attire, as though to convey the totality of power they had witnessed. High priests, too, were marked by fragrance, though theirs carried an added layer of sanctity. Specific combinations were prepared exclusively for temple ceremonies, believed to purify and transform the wearer into a vessel fit for communion with the gods. One blend, spoken of in fragmented hymns, combined myrrh with lesser-known native herbs that have yet to be conclusively identified, plants whose elusive signatures may still linger in dark soil somewhere along forgotten irrigation canals. These ceremonial scents clung to linen vestments and beards oiled before great processions, rising like a silent offering with every movement. Possessing such aromas was a privilege tightly controlled. Recipes were inscribed not on public walls, but on hidden papyri or whispered from master to successor under oaths as binding as any political treaty. Even among the elite, few could command these precise blends. To wear them without rightful cause would have been a dangerous presumption, inviting suspicion of treachery or sacrilege. And so, fragrance in Egypt was stratified as rigidly as society itself. From the market cones of scented fat worn by festival crowds to the intricate perfumes reserved for thrones and altars, scent articulated power in ways that no spoken proclamation could rival. A pharaoh's approach was heralded by a warm, complex sweetness that no merchant stall could replicate, an invisible standard that set him apart as chosen by the gods themselves. In this way, perfume became an unspoken language of dominion, a fragrant seal that affirmed one's place in the delicate hierarchy of earth and heaven alike. Behind the solemn facades of Egypt's sprawling palaces, beneath ceilings painted with soaring falcons and fields of stars, life churned with passions and rivalries as potent as any that would later rock the courts of Europe or Asia. The air here was thick not just with incense, but with ambition, jealousy, whispered secrets, and sometimes scandal spun from the very scents meant to elevate and delight. Fragrance was never neutral in such settings. When the ruling class wielded perfume as a symbol of divine endorsement and cultivated beauty, it became an easy tool for schemes more human than holy. A single drop of oil dabbed onto a wrist or woven through hair could ignite curiosity, desire, or suspicion, setting into motion a chain of events that might reshape the entire balance of power. One story, pieced together from fragments of temple graffiti and cautious allusions in administrative scrolls, tells of a favored consort whose sudden rise to prominence in the royal court coincided with her adoption of a striking new perfume. The scent was described as unusually complex, a tangle of sweet lotus, tart resin, and something musky that lingered in corridors long after she had passed. Courtiers began to murmur that it was more than a cosmetic pleasure, that perhaps the blend contained rare herbs whispered to cloud judgment or inflame affection. Her star soared, drawing envy as well as petitions. Lesser officials crowded to her antechambers, hoping a word in her perfumed presence might tip decrees or tax settlements in their favor. Yet as swiftly as fortune had smiled, it twisted away. A rival faction at court seized on the rumors, suggesting to the pharaoh's advisors that such powerful scents might be a veiled act of manipulation, a subtle bewitchment threatening the sacred impartiality of the throne. Almost overnight, her rooms were searched under pretense of inventorying valuables. Her storerooms of oils were seized and examined. When she was quietly dismissed from court, the scent that had once heralded her triumph faded from the palace halls, a ghostly reminder of how quickly favor could sour. Priestly circles were not immune to such intrigues either. In Thebes, an ambitious temple overseer was accused by his detractors of using specially prepared incenses to tilt oracular outcomes. These were the moments when priests, swaying before towering statues and inhaling heavy clouds of perfume, delivered divine verdicts that could settle land disputes or pronounce on guilt and innocence. If the overseer's incense was altered, spiked with secret additions known only to his closest allies, it might lead to utterances that conveniently aligned with his patron's interests. Though little official record survives of his ultimate fate, temple payroll lists show sudden changes in staff shortly thereafter, hinting at purges cloaked in ritual discretion. Even beyond deliberate sabotage, the charged atmosphere of court life meant that mere association with certain scents could destroy reputations. If a noblewoman was seen favoring a fragrance closely linked with the royal household, rivals might whisper she was overreaching, presuming too intimate a connection with the throne. Conversely, adopting the simpler local blends worn by commoners could be twisted into accusations of neglecting one's divine obligations to display wealth and honor. In this dance of perceptions, choosing what to smell like was a decision as political as arranging marriages or forging trade alliances. So perfume, in Egypt, was far from an innocent delight. It was a stage for silent duels, a tool sharpened by rumor and fear. The same oils that marked a person as uniquely blessed could, under the wrong breath of gossip, brand them as dangerously ambitious or faithfully reckless. And when scandal finally erupted, it often did so invisibly at first. A subtle shift in who turned away in the corridor, who ceased sending tokens of respect, who quietly arranged to occupy newly vacated chambers. Thus, within walls painted to proclaim eternal harmony and cosmic order, fragrance proved a delicately scented blade, just as capable of carving out destinies as the coldest bronze dagger. In the bustling heart of Egypt's cities, where markets spilled into sunlit courtyards and narrow alleys rang with the calls of merchants, the trade in aromatic goods was a lifeline as vital as grain. Caravans and ships delivered precious bundles of resin, stacks of fragrant woods, baskets brimming with petals destined to become costly oils. But these were not commodities handled lightly or left to the mercy of unscrupulous dealers. From the bustling docks of Memphis to the quiet counting rooms of temple estates, the traffic in scents was watched over with a meticulous, often stern hand. Records scratched into shards of pottery and inked on rolls of papyrus reveal a world where laws reached even into the airy realm of perfume. Tax collectors maintained precise ledgers on the import of aromatic substances. When ships arrived bearing resin from Punt or cinnamon from distant coasts, official scribes were dispatched to the docks to tally the cargo. Every amphora and tightly bound parcel was assessed, its contents sampled and weighed. Taxes were levied not just as a routine matter of state revenue, but as a safeguard. By regulating these flows, authorities could protect both ritual sanctity, ensuring temples received unspoiled, properly sourced offerings, and the integrity of commercial life. Guild-like bodies of perfumers and merchants formed part of this oversight. Their members were expected to uphold quality, adhere to established recipes when preparing standard blends for temple use, and ensure that weights were honest. Contracts survive that laid out exact penalties if a supplier was found substituting inferior gum or stretching oil with common animal fat. Fines could be severe enough to wipe out a small operation overnight. In more serious cases, particularly when fraud touched temple provisions or goods destined for the royal household, the offending parties risked losing licenses entirely, shutting them out of the trade that was often the bedrock of their families' fortunes. Temples themselves acted as powerful regulatory bodies. As some of the largest consumers of aromatic substances, they appointed inspectors who roamed markets to test samples, compare scents, and verify claims of origin. A merchant found cheating might not only pay in silver, but see his name blacklisted among priests, effectively choking off the most lucrative avenue for his wares. There were also subtler social costs. In tight-knit quarters of artisans and traders, reputation traveled quickly. A seller whispered to have adulterated imported incense might find neighbors reluctant to stand surety for his next caravan loan, or see family marriage negotiations quietly collapse. In a society that valued harmony and the careful balance of Ma'at, the concept of cosmic and social order, such failures rippled out far beyond the first dishonest deal. Interestingly, some papyri include notes that suggest efforts at consumer protection resembling cautious trial by sample. Before a bulk purchase was finalized, buyers might require the merchant to break open a sealed vessel and apply the oil or resin to a small heated dish, releasing its full aroma. Only then, satisfied that the perfume met expectations, would they conclude the transaction. Seals placed on new jars in the presence of witnesses to guarantee contents remained pure. In this way, the trade in scent was framed by both the heavy hand of state and the lighter, yet no less binding, weight of community scrutiny. Laws carved in temple decrees and contracts inked in cramped script worked together to uphold the delicate trust that turned fragile petals and sticky resins into enduring wealth. Perfume was more than luxury. It was a matter of public faith, an agreement between seller and buyer, worshiper and God, all bound by the expectation that what rose on each fragrant curl of smoke was true and uncorrupted. Far from the gilded walls of palaces and the incense-flooded chambers of temples, life in Egypt pulsed through neighborhoods of artisans, traders, dock workers, and soldiers. Their streets were alive with heat, dust, human sweat. And yet even here, amid the clamor of hammers on copper and the creak of carts groaning under baskets of fish, fragrance threaded quietly through daily existence. For the common craftsman or builder, perfume was no elaborate luxury crafted from rare imports, but it was still deeply woven into the fabric of life. At dawn, men who spent their days shaping blocks of limestone under a pitiless sun or hammering gold leaf into tiny amulets might rub themselves with modest blends of local herbs steeped in animal fat. Mint, sweet rush, crushed marjoram, these were humble, accessible scents that took the edge off sweat. served as a polite nod to neighbors in crowded courtyards, and brought small pleasure to evening meals when families gathered under awnings to share bread and beer. Public festivals or local processions offered chances for even these modest fragrances to bloom into more memorable displays. Before holidays, marketplaces filled with sellers hawking small cones of scented fat, colored with natural dyes, so they looked almost like tiny fruits. Bought cheaply, worn on the head, these cones would melt slowly in the sun or under the crush of a dance, sending trickles of perfume down braids and necks. Neighbors laughed together at whose scent was strongest, whose lasted longest, as drums echoed between mud brick walls. For soldiers, perfume often took on an edge of practicality as much as personal pride. Campaigns meant weeks away from clean water, and rubbing scented salves into skin helped mask the inevitable staleness of sweat and leather. Some regiments even developed reputations tied to their favored blends. One commander might be known for the sharp, almost biting odor of juniper mixed with resin that clung to his armor and lingered intense long after he departed. Young recruits sometimes pooled wages to buy small jars from local vendors before marches, hoping to carry a whiff of home into distant, uncertain lands. Meanwhile, the cities themselves offered a kaleidoscope of overlapping aromas. Step through a narrow street at midday, and you might be enveloped first by the pungency of fish guts thrown onto piles for stray cats, only to pass a doorway where a potter's wife had set bunches of drying herbs to ward off insects, their sharp green notes slicing through the heavier air. Nearby, a baker's courtyard sent up rich waves of yeast and honey, mingling unexpectedly with drifting threads of perfume from a neighboring cloth dyer's apprentice, who dabbed oil behind her ears before leaning out a window to call to friends. In this way, scent in Egypt belonged to all levels of life. Even when expensive imports were out of reach, people found ways to claim fragrance as their own, using what grew by canals or was traded in small cloth bundles from farm to village. It became not only a shield against the less pleasant truths of crowded living, but also a modest joy, a reminder that, in a world where most labored hard under the sun, a sweet breath of mint or a teasing wisp of myrrh could lift the spirit, carrying them, if only for a heartbeat, towards something softer, something briefly touched by grace. In the quiet courtyards tucked behind bustling markets or palace walls, the real birthplaces of Egypt's fragrances came alive each day under careful, practiced hands. These were not vast factories belching smoke, but intimate workshops where the air itself seemed to vibrate with scent, every surface dusted with powdered petals or streaked by oily fingertips. It was here, among simple clay hearths and polished mortars, that the intricate dance of turning raw nature into perfume unfolded. The work often began in the early morning, when petals held their richest essence. Young apprentices moved through small gardens or along riverbanks with baskets strapped to their backs, gathering blue lotus blooms still heavy with dew, or clipping heads of marjoram and sweet rush before the sun could bleach their potency. Once returned to the workshop, the petals were spread across woven mats, inspected for rot or blemish, then piled into large, shallow mortars. Bronze pestles worked in rhythmic circles, crushing fragile tissue until the mixture released vivid streaks of color and a lush, immediate perfume. For tougher ingredients, bark, woods, certain sturdy herbs, the process was more forceful. Heavy grindstones, sometimes turned by two people, reduced chunks into coarse powder. These grounds might be sifted through fine reed sieves to separate larger splinters, ensuring only the most uniform bits continued into the next stage. Meanwhile, fats awaited their transformation. Rendered from cattle or geese, they simmered in wide bronze pans, set atop low brick hearths, tended constantly so they did not scorch. Into these warm, gently bubbling baths went bundles of crushed petals tied in loose linen, or porous cloth pouches filled with aromatic woods. Over hours, sometimes days, The fat drank in the plant's secrets, turning translucent and fragrant. Workers stirred with long-handled paddles, lifting out bundles to press them and return every last drop to the pot. This slow enfleurage, where warm fat coaxed out scent, was often repeated multiple times with fresh petals to intensify the perfume's body. Between infusions, the mixture cooled in glazed jars. Once it held a depth of aroma judged sufficient by the master perfumer's discerning nose, it was strained through tightly woven cloth, squeezing out clear, softly colored oil that glistened in the afternoon light. For resins and gums, heat played a different role. Small cauldrons were set over carefully banked coals, melting lumps of myrrh or frankincense into thick, viscous pools. Sometimes wine or water was added to control the consistency, or a bit of honey stirred in to round out bitterness. The air grew dense and sweet, almost intoxicating, as vapors rolled across the courtyard. Those close to the pots often came away with their hair and tunics faintly tacky, bearing a scent that clung for days. Instruments varied from elegant to humble: bronze strainers with patterned holes, reed sieves woven tight as fine linen, spatulas carved from tamarisk wood, porous ceramic funnels that wicked away impurities drop by patient drop. Even simple flat stones had a role, used to smear small test batches and watch how they set, how they shone, how their scent unfolded on warm skin. And always there was the human element, the constant tasting of air, the hand brought thoughtfully to the nose, the slight narrowing of eyes as a craftsman weighed whether a mixture needed more crushed cypress or another day of steeping. Recipes were not lifeless formulas scratched on papyrus, they were living traditions, each adjusted subtly to the humidity of the season, the vigor of that year's harvest, even to the mood of the senior perfumer overseeing it all. In these modest spaces, with simple tools and deep intuition, Egypt's artisans spun flowers and resin into liquid gold. Each vial produced was the culmination of countless small judgments and silent expertise, a fragile triumph over nature's fleeting gifts, sealed carefully in alabaster or faience to wait for the moment someone would lift it to their skin and let it whisper its story into the world. Throughout Egypt, from the humblest village courtyards to the grand pylons of Karnak, scent was more than an ornament or indulgence. It was woven deeply into the fabric of what it meant to be clean, both in the flesh and in the soul. In a land where the sun's relentless blaze could turn sweat sour by mid-morning and the Nile's lush banks bred life in joyous excess, insects, marsh vapors, quick decay, maintaining freshness was both a practical concern and a profound moral imperative. To the Egyptian mind, true cleanliness was never limited to scrubbing dust from the feet or rinsing grime from the arms. It reached inward, touching upon one's very worthiness before the gods. A person who reeked of rot or stale labor stood, by their standards, at risk of cosmic imbalance. Thus, scent, with its ability to mask unpleasant realities and elevate the senses towards something finer, became a vital ally in the constant quest for harmony. Before entering temples, worshippers performed ablutions at stone basins, pouring cool water over hands and faces. But water was only the beginning. Temple attendants often offered small dabs of perfumed oil, massaging it into visitors' palms or smoothing it across the neck. In this way, each person not only washed away visible dirt, but cloaked themselves in an aroma that signaled purity, readiness to stand in sacred company. Some rituals went further. Priests undergoing prolonged periods of service slept on beds sprinkled with aromatic herbs, their bodies continually steeped in fragrances meant to keep them spiritually as well as physically unblemished. In homes, families observed milder but similar customs. During festivals or life milestones, a child's first haircut, a daughter's wedding day, the assumption of new household duties by a young man, elders might anoint participants with modest blends of local flowers and oils. This was less about luxury than about signaling a transition from ordinary concerns into a state prepared for something weightier, touched by grace. Even in sickness, scent took on this dual burden. Doctors applied fragrant salves not only to soothe and heal, but to ward off malevolent forces believed to hover where odors turned foul. Rooms of the unwell were fumigated with burning bundles of herbs or shallow dishes of warming resin, both to cleanse the air and to persuade restless spirits to drift elsewhere. In these moments, families stood together, breathing in the same purifying smoke, sharing an act of communal hope. And of course, when the final journey loomed, perfumes crowned a lifetime's devotion to purity. Embalmers lavished bodies with oils drawn from far reaches of Egypt's trade routes, saturating linen wrappings with scents that promised to carry the deceased safely into the realm of the gods. To arrive there fragrant was to arrive respected, your soul's readiness for eternity proclaimed by every soft breath of lotus or myrrh that rose from your quiet form. So it was that in Egypt, to smell sweet was to wear a badge of uprightness, of spiritual preparation. The smallest child with a smear of marjoram oil, the high priest bathed in elaborate temple blends, the grandmother sprinkling rush-stalk cuttings beneath a bed, all participated in a vast, fragrant choreography meant to keep the world in balance. In this way, perfume transcended adornment to become an act of devotion, a declaration that one stood clean in body and clear in heart, fit to take one's place within the careful order of heaven and earth. Trace the shimmering trail of a modern perfume, and more often than not, it winds backward through time, threading delicately among temple columns and sunlit courtyards of ancient Egypt. The very language perfumers use today, words like balsamic, resinous, spicy floral, echoes choices first made along the Nile, where artisans blended fragrances not just to delight the senses, but to whisper to gods and spirits alike. Many of the key notes cherished by contemporary fragrance houses were once cornerstones of Egyptian compositions. Myrrh, with its warm, slightly medicinal richness, appears again and again in today's perfumes, often in base notes where it anchors lighter florals or spices, much as it once sealed the dignity of temple rituals. Frankincense, too, remains a perennial favorite, its bright, citrus-laced opening and smoky dry-down lending an aura of mystery that modern noses still read as sacred or meditative, instinctively recognizing what priests once hoped to conjure on rising curls of smoke. Then there is the lotus, so vividly tied to Egyptian art and myth. While true blue lotus is rare and nuanced, modern perfumers often recreate its profile using combinations of aquatic florals and faintly green accords, layering in whispers of sweetness that nod to the bloom's age-old symbolism of rebirth and divine favor. When a perfume today boasts a lotus heart, it carries forward a lineage that stretches back to bouquets laid at the feet of gods in painted sanctuaries. Even the practice of composing multi-tiered fragrances, where lighter top notes dance away first, revealing richer heart, and finally deep, lingering base, finds philosophical kinship in Egypt's approach. Ancient recipes carefully balanced fleeting floral pleasures with lasting resins and woods, ensuring the scent evolved with the heat of the body, continuing to unfold long after it was first applied. This sensitivity to time, to the story a perfume tells across hours, is an inheritance modern perfumers hold close, whether they work in Paris ateliers or small independent studios. Beyond ingredients and structure, the Egyptian obsession with fragrance as an extension of identity endures powerfully. To them, scent was a declaration of status, of readiness for sacred spaces, of personal charisma. Ideas we echo every time we choose a signature perfume or spritz on something special to mark a new phase in life. Even the notion of fragrance as armor or allure, a silent companion that precedes us into rooms or lingers after we depart, is straight from the world of harems and palace intrigues, where a carefully chosen blend could advance ambitions or seal affections. So the next time a warm gust carries a swirl of cinnamon and resin past you, or a fine mist of perfume on your wrist blooms into something rich and softly floral by afternoon, remember that you're sharing in an unbroken, millennia-old tradition. What was once daubed behind the ears of queens or pressed into linen for a journey beyond this life continues now in sleek glass bottles on dressing tables, each drop a tiny fragrant thread tying us to the ancient perfumed heart of Egypt. Imagine standing at the threshold of a crumbling hall, its once proud pillars etched by wind and time, the painted lilies on their capitals now no more than faint whispers of color. The air hangs heavy with a hush that feels deeper than silence, as though all the voices of priests, artisans, lovers, and warriors have retreated into stone, leaving behind only this, a final exhalation of an age. Breathe in, and what comes to you first is the solemn resin of frankincense, rising like a thin, wavering prayer from unseen braziers. It is sharp at the edges, almost citrus at the top, then mellows into something warm and knowing, carrying the memory of countless offerings poured out on temple altars beneath painted stars. Layered upon it is the darker pull of myrrh, sweet but tinged with sorrow, recalling the hands that anointed bodies for journeys beyond breath, whispering hopes that love and lineage might find safe passage into eternity. Turn your head slightly, and there drifts the ghost of blue lotus, fragile, evasive, cool as moonlight on water. It brings with it soft laughter in shaded gardens, the rustle of linen gowns, eyes that dance with unspoken plots. Intertwined is the faint tang of crushed mint and marjoram, simple herbs once rubbed into the skin by soldiers and festival-goers alike, their humble joy mingling with the heavy incense of palaces. Beneath all this lies the deep hum of aged cedar, carved into chests that held amulets and letters, coffers that locked away state secrets, and delicate jars of perfume destined only for royal flash. Its breath is steady, solemn, a patient witness to the slow fading of grandeur. And somewhere within this intricate weave lingers the salt of distant seas, the sun-baked dust of caravan roads, the faintly animal musk of goose fat and honeyed oils pressed by countless hands into countless jars. Together, they tell a story of ships moored at busy quays, of markets alive with bargaining voices, of workshops hidden behind whitewashed walls where young apprentices leaned close to steaming vats, learning to bind beauty into liquid form. In this imagined scent, part temple, part boudoir, part sunlit street, the entire spirit of Egypt seems to gather for a last delicate breath. It is a perfume of triumph and tenderness, of power wielded and lost, of lives danced out beneath a sky that seemed to promise eternity. And as it curls away into the warm dusk, leaving only a memory on the air, it carries with it the laughter, the prayers, the quiet ambitions of a people who wove fragrance into every heartbeat of their civilization. So it fades, not into emptiness, but into the waiting hush of history, where, even now, someone leaning over a shattered alabaster jar might catch the barest ghost of it, and, for a fleeting instant, stand once more in the company of pharaohs.